There are people in a life who are not friends in any ordinary sense of the word. They are something older than friendship, and harder to name the people who knew you before you knew yourself, who were present at the beginning of the thing that became your life, who carry the version of you that existed before the world got hold of you, and shaped you into something more manageable and less true. Christopher Reeve was that person for Robin Williams. They had met in 1973, in a rehearsal room at the Juilliard School in New York City. Two young men accepted into the same drama division class, 20 students selected from hundreds of applicants to spend their formative years learning the craft of becoming other people. Christopher Reeve was tall, classically handsome, possessed of a physical presence that filled a room before he spoke. Robin Williams was compact, restless, already generating an energy that made the air around him feel different, charged, slightly unpredictable, like the atmosphere before a storm that might turn into something extraordinary or might simply pass. They were, on the surface, everything the other was not, and they became, within weeks of that first rehearsal room, the closest thing either of them would ever have to a person who knew the whole story. That is the thing that matters about what happened in the autumn of 2004, when Christopher Reeve died at the age of 52, 9 years after the equestrian accident that had left him paralyzed from the shoulders down. 9 years of fighting with a ferocity and a public dignity that had made him into something larger than a person, something that people invoked when they needed to believe that the human body could be survived. When Christopher Reeve died, Robin Williams went to the memorial service with a folded piece of paper in his jacket pocket. And what happened when he stood at the lectern was something that the people in that room have never stopped talking about, and never quite managed to describe accurately, because what they witnessed was not a eulogy in any conventional sense of the word. It was something that can only happen when one person who truly knew another person is asked to speak, in public, about what that knowing contained. This is that story. But to understand what Robin Williams carried to that lectern in October 2004, you have to understand what he had been carrying since November 1973 and what 31 years of a friendship that began in a Juilliard rehearsal room had made him capable of giving. The Juilliard years were formative in ways that both men would spend decades unpacking. The drama division's training was rigorous, classical, demanding in the specific way that serious artistic training is demanding. It asked students not only to acquire technique, but to excavate themselves, to find in their own emotional experience the raw material that technique could then shape into something transferable, something that could reach another person across the distance of a stage. Robin Williams found this process simultaneously exhilarating and exposing. He was already, in 1973, a performer in the fullest sense, someone who could inhabit characters with the instinctive fluency of a person who had been doing it since childhood, in the empty rooms of a Michigan house. But Juilliard asked him to do something harder than inhabit characters. It asked him to stop and be still and find what was actually there when the performance fell away. Christopher Reeve, who was working through his own version of the same excavation, became the person Robin could be still with. In the language of that particular friendship, stillness was not silence. They talked constantly, argued about everything, made each other laugh in the specific, slightly dangerous way of two people who have found the exact frequency of each other's humor. But beneath the noise of the friendship, there was a quality of rest that Robin Williams found almost nowhere else. An ease. The particular ease of being with someone who does not require you to perform. This was, for Robin Williams, an extraordinary gift. He performed constantly, not only on stage and eventually on screen, but in every room he entered, every conversation he had. The performance, a form of connection, and simultaneously a form of protection. Christopher Reeve saw through the performance to the person behind it with a directness that was never unkind, but was always complete. He did not make Robin feel exposed by seeing him clearly. He made him feel known. They left Juilliard before completing the program, both of them, in different years, called away by the specific urgencies of careers that were already beginning. They stayed in contact with the persistence of people who understand that what they have is unusual. When Christopher Reeve became Superman in 1978 and Robin Williams became Mork in the same year, their respective ascents to a particular kind of fame were witnessed by someone who had known them before the fame arrived, and was therefore one of the only people capable of treating it accurately as a change in circumstance rather than a change in person. The accident happened on the 27th of May, 1995. Christopher Reeve fell from a horse at an equestrian competition in Culpeper, Virginia. He was paralyzed instantly, the first and second cervical vertebrae fractured, the spinal cord compressed, the body's ability to breathe independently gone. He was placed on a ventilator. The prognosis was as severe as a prognosis can be. Robin Williams was in the middle of a film shoot when he heard. He flew to the hospital in Charlottesville, Virginia. What he did when he arrived, the appearance in scrubs and a fake Russian accent, claiming to be a proctologist, performing for Christopher Reeve in the moment before major surgery, in the attempt to give his oldest friend something to laugh at before the cutting began, has been documented, and Christopher Reeve wrote about it in his memoir, and it is the version of the story that most people know. But there is a version that is less known. After the surgery, after the immediate crisis had passed and Christopher Reeve was in the long, beginning phase of what his life was now going to be, Robin Williams came back, not once, repeatedly. Not with performances, not with humor deployed as a defensive maneuver against the weight of what had happened. He came back and sat in the hospital room and was with his friend in the way that the Juilliard years had taught him to be with someone, present, still, not requiring anything of the moment except that it be honest. He helped Christopher Reeve decide to go on, not with a speech, not with an argument, not with anything that could be written down and repeated accurately, with presence, the specific, sustained presence of someone who has known you since before you were a public person and is therefore one of the only people qualified to tell you that the person who exists after the catastrophe is still the person who existed before. Christopher Reeve went on. He went on for 9 years, advocating for spinal cord research, directing, writing, speaking, refusing to be defined by what his body could no longer do in any terms that reduced him to the injury. He went on with the particular ferocity of a man who had been given a reason to. Robin Williams was one of the reasons. Christopher Reeve died on the 10th of October, 2004. He was 52 years old. The memorial service was held in New York City, in a space that reflected the scale of what Christopher Reeve had become in the public imagination. Not just Superman, not just the actor, but the man who had survived his own catastrophe with a grace that had made him into something the world needed him to be. The service was attended by people from every dimension of Christopher Reeve's life: family, colleagues from the worlds of film and theater, advocates and researchers from the spinal cord injury community, public figures who had worked with him on the causes he had championed. Robin Williams was there. He was not the only person who spoke. The service had been arranged with care. The eulogists chosen to represent different aspects of Christopher Reeve's life and work. Robin Williams was toward the end of the program, a placement that the service's organizers later said was intentional, that they had known instinctively that whatever Robin Williams did when he stood at that lectern should be the last thing the room heard before it dispersed. He sat through the other eulogies with the focused, comprehensive attention he always brought to a room. He listened with the kind of stillness that people who knew him well recognized as the mode he entered when he was receiving something important. The other speakers were good-moving, precise, each one giving the room a piece of Christopher Reeve that illuminated a different facet of who he had been. Robin Williams held his folded piece of paper. When his name was called, he stood. He walked to the lectern. He placed the folded paper in front of him on the lectern's surface. He looked out at the room for a long moment, the specific pause of a man who was deciding something, though the decision had been made before he arrived, and what he was doing was gathering himself for the cost of it. He unfolded the paper. He read one line. He stopped. He looked at the line. He looked at the room. He looked back at the line. Then he folded the paper carefully, placed it in his jacket pocket, and looked up. What Robin Williams did for the next 45 minutes without notes, without preparation in any form that could be written on paper, drawing entirely from 31 years of a friendship that had begun in a Juilliard rehearsal room in 1973, has been described by everyone who witnessed it as unlike anything they had heard before or after at a memorial service. He began with Juilliard, with the rehearsal room, with the specific absurdity of two young men who had absolutely nothing in common except the fact that they were both slightly terrifying to the people around them in ways they themselves did not yet understand. He described Christopher Reeve, at 20 years old, the physical presence, the voice, the particular quality of serious attention that Reeve brought to everything, the way he could walk into a room and organize it around himself, simply by being in it. He described what it felt like to be seen by that attention, to be the person Christopher Reeve chose to sit with in the stairwells between classes, to argue with about the things that mattered, to perform for in the improvised late-night shows they gave for each other in empty rehearsal rooms when the formal training had ended for the day, and the real work, the work of figuring out who they were, was still going on. He told a story that no one in the room had heard before, a night in the winter of 1973, when both of them were struggling with something he did not specify what. And the room understood that the specificity did not matter, and Christopher Reeve had said something to him that Robin had been unable to forget in 31 years. He did not quote it directly. He described what it had done, how it had rearranged something in him that had needed rearranging, how it had come from a person who saw him clearly enough to know exactly what was required, how it had been delivered without ceremony or strategy, the way that the most important things are always delivered. The room was completely still. He talked about the years of fame, about what it was like to be Robin Williams and Christopher Reeve, simultaneously, two people who had become famous in the same year, from the same starting point, for completely different reasons, and who therefore understood each other's experience of celebrity in a way that almost no one else could. He talked about the phone calls in the years when both of them were at the height of what the world had decided they were, and how those calls were the ones where they were most fully themselves, most like the two young men in the Juilliard stairwells, least like the public figures the world had made of them. He talked about the accident. He did not describe it clinically. He described what it was like to receive the phone call in the language of a man speaking about the worst thing he had ever heard, making no attempt to frame it in terms that were easier to receive. He described the drive to the airport, the flight to Virginia, the walk through the hospital corridor toward a room he did not yet know how to walk into. He described the Russian doctor. He did not tell it as a joke. He told it as what it actually was, an act of desperation, a person who knew only one way to reach his friend across the new, enormous distance of the catastrophe, and chose to use it, knowing it might not work, knowing it was all he had. He told it as a story about fear, about the terrifying moment when the thing you have always used to connect with people, the performance, the comedy, the voice, and the timing and the characters, is all you can offer. A man lying in a hospital bed before major surgery, and you choose to use it not because you believe it is enough, but because it is yours and you give what you have. He laughed, Robin Williams said. And I knew he was still there. I knew the person I knew was still there, inside everything that had happened, and that was the only thing I needed to know that afternoon. The room held that. He talked about the 9 years. Not as a narrative of decline, he was specific about this, insistent in the quiet way of someone correcting a misunderstanding they care about deeply. Christopher Reeve's 9 years after the accident were not a diminished version of the life that preceded them. They were a different version, and in certain respects, in the quality of attention Christopher Reeve brought to the things he chose to do, in the specific clarity of purpose that can only come to a person who has had to choose, consciously and repeatedly, to continue, they were more fully lived than the years before. He talked about what Christopher Reeve had taught him in those 9 years. not through speeches or formal conversations, but through the specific example of what it looked like to continue to show up every day to the particular life that was available, rather than grieving the life that was not. He talked about visiting the house in Bedford, New York, where Christopher Reeve lived with his wife Dana and their children. About sitting in the room with his friend and finding that the quality of attention Christopher Reeve brought to a conversation had not diminished by a fraction, that the person across from him was as fully present, as fully himself, as he had been in a Juilliard rehearsal room in 1973. He taught me, Robin Williams said, that the body is not the person. That what I loved about Chris, what everyone in this room loved about Chris, was never in the things his body could do. It was in the way he thought, the way he saw things, the way he made the people around him feel that they were worth his full attention. And none of that changed, not one bit of it. He paused. I kept waiting for it to change, he said. I kept thinking, this is when it will have cost too much. This is when the person I know will have been worn away by everything it takes to live the life he is living. And it never happened. He was always there. All of him. Every time. He was near the end, though no one in the room was aware of time in the usual sense. He talked about the last time he had seen Christopher Reeve, several months before his death. He described the specific details of the visit with the precision of a man who had known, somewhere below conscious awareness, that it would be the last. The quality of the afternoon light through the windows, the conversation they had, the things that were said, and the longer silences between them that had always been a language of their own. He talked about what Christopher Reeve had said near the end of that last visit, something about the nature of friendship, about what it meant to have been truly known by another person. Robin Williams did not quote it directly. He described what it felt like to receive it, the specific feeling of being seen, one final time, by the person who had been seeing you most clearly for 31 years. And then he stopped. He did not wrap it up. He did not provide a conclusion, a summary, a final formulation that would give the room something to carry out with them in a form that was easier to hold than grief. He simply stopped, in the middle of a sentence that had nowhere particular to go, and stood at the lectern in the silence. The room stayed in the silence with him. After perhaps 30 seconds, which felt, to the people present, like a much longer time, he reached into his jacket pocket and took out the folded piece of paper. He placed it on the lectern without unfolding it. I wrote something, he said. I had something prepared. But Chris didn't need prepared. Chris needed true. So that's what I gave him. He picked up the paper. He put it back in his pocket. He walked away from the lectern. The room did not applaud immediately. The silence continued for a long moment after he had returned to his seat, the silence of people who have been given something that requires sitting with before anything else can happen. And then the room found its voice, and what it gave was not the applause of an audience for a performance, but something else, something that has no precise name, the sound of people acknowledging that they have been in the presence of something true. Dana Reeve, Christopher Reeve's wife, who had been beside him through every year of the 9, whose own grace under a weight that would have broken most people had made her as beloved as her husband, spoke to Robin Williams briefly after the service. What she said to him is private, and he kept it private. But those who observed the exchange describe a brief conversation between two people who understood each other's loss in specific and irreducible terms, in which something was given and received that was appropriate to everything that had led to it. Robin Williams left the service alone, which was how he had arrived. He walked out of the building into the October afternoon, his jacket pocket containing the folded piece of paper with the single line that he had read and then set aside. He kept the paper. People who knew him in the years that followed have mentioned seeing it in his wallet, eventually, folded small, carried the way people carry things they are not ready to put down. What was written on it is not known. The paper was private, and the privacy of it was a form of respect for the person it was written about. But the room in New York City in October 2004 received something that no piece of paper could have contained: 31 years of a friendship rendered in 45 minutes of unrehearsed, unprotected honesty by a man who had spent his entire life performing and chose, in the moment that mattered most, to simply speak the truth about someone he loved. He had tried to prepare. He had written something down. He had read one line and understood that preparation was the wrong thing entirely. He put the paper in his pocket, and he gave Christopher Reeve what Christopher Reeve had always given him, the full, unmediated, completely honest truth of being known by someone who loved you and was not afraid to say exactly what that knowing contained. That is what the empty chair at the lectern represented, in the silence after Robin Williams walked away from it. Not absence. The presence of someone who had been there completely, who had shown up, in the truest sense, for the last time, and whose going left behind a quality of having been that the room could still feel in the silence. Christopher Reeve had always been there. Robin Williams made sure the room knew it. And the paper stayed in his pocket. And the room stayed changed. And the friendship, the thing that had begun in a rehearsal room in 1973 between two young men who had nothing in common except the terrifying specificity of their gifts, continued, the way the best things continue, not in the person, but in everyone who was changed by knowing them.